I would like to welcome you to the 16th class in the UBC Ecosystem Modeling course called FISH 501. Today we have Yu-Chun Kao from USGS talking, but I will get back to that in just a few minutes. Let me start off then by acknowledging that we here at UBC are at Coast Salish territory, and we acknowledge that we are at the traditional, ancestral and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh people. I would also like to remind you that recordings are available at the Ecopath YouTube channel and the Facebook page. We had a problem last class with Facebook Live, but everything seems to be working today, so fortunately. But the recordings are available if you want to listen to those at a later point. And also, if you would like to get the lectures and tutorials and so on, they are available at the course website. With this, I'd like to welcome Yu-Chun Kao, who's a biologist at the USGS Great Lakes Research Center in Ann Arbor. And Yu-Chun works with anthropogenic impacts and invasions is part of this, the ecology of that. And he will be talking about modeling invasive species in the Great Lakes. It's actually related to a talk he gave for the Ecopath lecture series in the autumn. And it's a really neat presentation. So, Yu-Chun, I will stop sharing here and pass the word to you.
Thanks, Billy, for the introduction. And I think you are seeing my screen now, do you?
We do, yes.
Okay, I'm going to start. Good morning, everyone. It's already afternoon in Ann Arbor. And I am Yu-Chun Kao from United States Geological Survey's Great Lakes Science Center, first generation immigrant. So, but I have been in Michigan for 16 years, and all of my research, I can say most of my research has been related to species, invasive species. So here I am going to talk about modeling species invasions. So it is slightly different from modeling invasive species. I can talk to you more about that later. And if you know anything about the Great Lakes, you probably have heard that we have a lot of invasive species. One time we were even out of adjectives for invasive species, so we just call them invasive species, new invasive species, and then now we have newer invasive species. So this is a guest lecture, not a presentation, so I try to be more relatable. This was when I started Ecopath with Ecosim modeling. It was in 2008. And in 2009, we have this Ecopath with Ecosim 25 years conference and workshop. So I wrote a mini proposal to get some funding to attend this workshop. And you can see me here. And also Brian Landfest. He is very important in invasive species modeling to us. So I am still using the cup from that conference. You can see that in last 10 years. So, and we attended that workshop, and we believe we learned a lot from there. And then we started working on our research. I think overall, these workshops help us a lot and for a long time. So I am also very glad to see Philly is offering this course for you. And if you stay in this field, you will know this kind of technique can help you for a long time in your research. So for today's presentation, I will first give a brief introduction about our Great Lakes, and then I will talk about what we did for modeling invasive species in past 10 years. So most everything here can be freely used. I already got approval from our agency. So about the Laurentian Great Lakes, also which means North American Great Lakes, it is 5 large lakes between United States and Canada. So there are 8 United States Great Lakes states and the province of Ontario in Canada. And it is very important in many ways. So first of all, it contains a lot of liquid fresh water. The estimation is 20% of all surface liquid water on the Earth. It also created 1.3 million jobs and estimated at a total of $82 billion economic scale just in the US side. And among these figures, 2.2 billion per year was from recreational fishery. So similar to all the other freshwater ecosystems, these in developed country, we had a lot of stressors and a lot of management practices. And these stressors should look familiar. And but in last 50 years or so, the main problem has been invasive species. So this is across all 5 lakes. In each lake, you may have different problems, but for all 5 lakes, invasive species has been the problem we have. And about management practices, these are should be all familiar to you. Fisheries regulations, invasive species control, water quality management, and stocking. So stocking, basically, they just put in different species trying to create recreational or sustained fisheries. So when it comes to the ecological history of the Great Lakes, it is basically a history about different invasive species. So maybe in the early or in the first half of 20th century, we had overfishing problem. Sorry, it is not maybe, it is for sure. We had overfishing problem. But after that, starting from the 40s, 50s, our problem has been associated with invasive species. First, we have invasive species from Atlantic Ocean. That was because we built a canal so that Niagara Fall between Lake Erie and Lake Ontario no longer a barrier to these invasive species. So we had sea lamprey, alewife. This is sea lamprey. And they are parasitic. They suck blood from these large fish and killed a lot of fish. So sea lamprey is one. And then later we have alewife. So alewife is a small pelagic fish. And they just exploded because sea lamprey basically eliminated their predators. So large fish were gone, small fish came in, all from Atlantic Ocean. And because of that, people started to stock salmon. And meanwhile, we also have other control measures, sea lamprey control, pollution control. And later in this period, we have so-called newer invasive species. And these invasive species came in from ballast waters. So the large ship come in to the Great Lakes, and some of their ballast waters contained some villagers or juvenile of these invasive species. And these invasive species include these spiny water flea, Travis, Libra and quagga mussels, which has been really which have been really a big problem. And around the Gobi in their native area, they feed on these libra and quagga mussels, so that that's really a great habitat for them now. And meanwhile, we are also ongoing this oligotraffication process because of this water quality management agreement. So the nutrient in the lake has been declining, well, in most parts of the lake. And this is how clear the water now you can see. And it is very common. If you go to our lakes, you will see how clear the water is most frequently like this. So because of this process and the invasive species, we just see the declining crayfish biomass in last 20 or 30 years. So now I am going to talk about Ecopath with Ecosim for Great Lakes. So it really started at the, I think, late 90s. So at that time, Jane Kitchell, which is like an advisor of our advisors. So he started a couple projects doing Lake Superior modeling. So these are two pilot and then pilot studies and the pilot models. And there was a gap. And starting around 2010, there was another push of Ecopath with Ecosim modeling in this area. First, we want to have another tool in our pocket. And the second, we believe this tool is useful because I think the most appealing part is it provides a quick evaluations for how and why ecosystem changed. And because at that still to now, our ecosystem changed because of some bottom-up or top-down effects that cannot be easily assessed by say, single species or multi-species population models. You really want to use a more ecosystem-based approach. So then because of that, we had first or only 2 Ecopath modeling workshops. We invited Philly to come to Michigan to give us some tips about Ecopath with Ecosim modeling. And then we had AFS symposium in 2011. And today we have a lot of models for all five Great Lakes. Some of the models have been updated many times for Ecopath with different periods, and most of these models have Ecosim. So today, my focus will be talking about modeling species invasions. So to us, it is different from invasive species. It is because when you talk about invasive species, that species might be already established in the ecosystem. For Ecopath with Ecosim modeler, it is not really a problem. You just have that species as a group or multi-stanza groups in your Ecopath. Then you just do everything the same as what you do, just like a ecosystem without any invasive species. But the problem now really is modeling a species invasion. That means the species is not in Ecopath. So, for example, when we want to model species of zebra and quagga mussel, for example, so you may have the Ecopath year here. To us, that's the early 80s. And then you have these species invasion in this Ecosim period, and that species just can. So say For zebra mussel, it's by the end of the 80s, or for quagga mussel, that would be late 90s. So now you have this Ecopath model, and you also have, so nothing happened here. You have species invasion, and then the species invasion may be like that. So in theory, Ecopath is a snapshot of the food web before the invasion, so it should not include the species. So that's the theory. So if the current software cannot fit this theory, shall we just change the software? And then we did some pilot analysis, or pilot run of the study. No, I think, at least we think, it is much more complicated than that. So if it can be fixed by just with some minor tweak in the software, we would have done that, because we would apply funding to do that. So it is more than that. So there are several questions. So if you want to parameterize these invasive species in Ecopath, what do you need to do? You need an initial Ecopath. You need an initial biomass input in the model, and you also need to have these initial increase at the beginning of the invasion. So some very smart people thought these are the only problems, like us. So this is the beginning of, we are thinking about how to model species invasions. So, all right, I already covered that. So to solve those 4 problems, we had this first paper about modeling invasive species in Ecopath with Ecosim. And you can see 3 major players. They invited me many times, but my daughter was one, and just did not have time. My daughter was 1, and my wife was having my second daughter. So but this is a great paper led by Brian Lenthus. That was why I marked him in the Ecopath workshop. So here are the 4 methods. And the goal of this paper was to test these 4 methods in 2 models, and they include one Lake Huron model and one Lake Huron model. And whether these methods work was to test, so they evaluated whether these methods work, is whether any of these method could repeat the observed pattern. And that observed pattern include biomass of both native and invasive species. So here are the 4 methods. First is forced biomass. So set initial biomass in Ecopath at a high level, force biomass over time, force biomass of those invasive species over time. And or second method, set the initial biomass at a low level and run and use artificial fishery to remove those biomass before the invasion. At the time of invasion in the simulation, you release the fishery, let the invasive species biomass grow. And then the third is similar to the second, but with a high initial biomass. And then finally was a method using a high initial biomass using some forcing function to change the vulnerability so that the biomass can grow. So you can see initial biomass were mostly high. That was because the goal was to catch the high biomass at the initial at the beginning of invasion. So graphically, it is how it works. Forced biomass. So these two are invasion groups, dracaenate muscle and round goby. So just force the biomass over time, and you can see it actually feed. So these are several groups of interest. And you can see this is a figure directly exported from Ecosim. So forced biomass works okay. Low initial biomass, got some problem. The biomass did not really increase as observed. So this is a problem we experienced frequently. And you can still see some, that's probably changing nutrient load or something. I didn't really look into these models, but they consider this is still generally good feed. And then high initial biomass with fishing, so you can see slightly high. Note that these biomass are really too high, so you probably cannot see the high initial biomass here. So initial biomass, fishing down, and the release doesn't look super good to me. And finally, this is changing forcing, but with a high initial biomass. So it took some time to drive this biomass down to the desired level before their invasion. So these are the four methods. So in general, what's their final words? What's their final words? Their final words say that all of these methods could work, but you probably need to decide which one is the best fit to your need. So that's what we thought. And now it's 2021, 10 years after, almost 10 years after this exercise. What do we think about Lance's 2012 paper? So we think it is a very good start, but the focus was on fitting the observed pattern. So when we want to use one of these methods to run scenario simulations, we did not know what would happen, or we did not. If we could do it over again, I would put these into our evaluations too. So that is, sometimes we use some of these methods. It cannot pass the logical evaluations in scenario simulations. So it means logical evaluations means it is not a formal evaluation, but the results just cannot make sense. So we don't think those methods would work. And because you don't have these scenarios, you cannot answer a lot of the management questions. So I will give you some example here. So first, talking about the forced biomass. So this method was actually proposed by Mark Rogers, and Mark Rogers used this method in his Lake Michigan model. And so this model has a focus between this period. When you want to go do anything beyond this period or to do some scenario simulations, you just cannot do it very intuitively because your biomass of invasive species are forced. So if you want to answer a question like what will the biomass of these invasive species under ABCD scenario, then you cannot answer that because you already forced the biomass. How would you force this biomass into your scenario? you need to make assumptions, and you usually cannot make an assumption for the question people want you to answer. So the second problem is the biomass time series usually is not very good to begin with. This is because when an invasive species come in, our sampling gears for existing species could not fit the need to survey these invasive species effectively. So our bottom troll gear did not survey round goby very well. Our benthos survey gear, like the polar grab, did not survey the invasive species very well. That's the reason this may not be a very good biomass time series to begin with. So in this study, they only looked at the period between, so basically only looked at the Ecosim period, forced the biomass for round goby and jacynth, and trying to calibrate the biomass of the other groups in Ecopath. Then the second method by Lanthes et al. Was used by Hongyan Zhang et al. In their paper. Actually, this was the method she proposed, and a low initial biomass, and releasing, and so low initial biomass, artificial fishery, and then release the biomass. So she did not have a figure for the method, so I just made one myself. So the method works in this way: Ecopath, low biomass, and then artificial fishery, force the biomass to the low level, hypothetical invasion, and then release the scenario. So the focus of this study was an hypothetical invasive species, silver coral. We do not have these species in the Great Lakes right now. This limited what the method we can use. So for example, if you want to force biomass into the future or in the calibration, what if you don't even have the species in the system? So you cannot do that. That is the reason this method was used. This is also one of the main reasons this method was used relatively more frequently. So finally, the third and the fourth method with high initial biomass, to my knowledge, were never used. They were not used because I hope you remember this Ecopath equation. That is because if you have a high initial biomass in Ecopath, then it is not just Ecopath. It affected a lot of estimations of the mortality rates. So it usually would result in a mortality rate decomposed in a different way. So sometimes you can fix this problem by entering these other production parameters. But for the predators on these invasive species, you probably provided too much food to these predators to begin with. So all I am saying is you will have, if you entered a very high initial biomass, and if you are not thinking carefully, it is at a very high risk, resulting in a very wrong estimate of these mortality rates in the Ecosim model. So that's one of the, it is the main reason we are not using that method. So there is another method proposed by myself. And it is a combination of the lengthless method 2 and 4. So this could have been method 5 in lengthless et al. Paper if I could have time to join that project at the beginning of 2011. So our method was for the model Saginaw Bay Lake Huron, and the procedure was to have low initial biomass and force the biomass and the Q2B to 0 until invasion, and use forcing function for the invasive species dynamics, then fit the time series. So I used this method in all of my papers without any big problems. So graphically, it is like this. So forced the consumption to 0 at the beginning, and a model an initial increase of dracinate muscle, liberal muscle in this period, quagga muscle in this period, and it is a boom and bust like dynamics. So we have this boom and bust, boom and bust. And for dracinids as prey, so they just initially they were not vulnerable to the prey, and then they will be like this. And then we will feed to the model. It can generally catch the pattern, but still cannot reach the highest observed level. And then we only have data up to 1996. This is really our hypothesis. So fast forward to last 5 years, and we have a lot of experience for modeling invasive species. And then we developed a slightly different method from the 5 method I just described. So basically, we did not really develop a new method, but modified those methods based on our need. And we have 3 different scenarios of invasive species. One of them is like boom and bust, like round goby. The other one is it is still increasing today, like quagga mussel. The biomass is still increasing. And at the end of our, actually today, or at the end of our calibration period. And then finally, the other one is people want to know potential invasive species, like Asian carp, hypothetical invasion. And so we developed a method for each of these scenarios. And here are some of our highlights. So I want to say we have gone a long way. This paper was just published 2 days ago. So I think maybe before I finished, it's just after I finished the slide I sent to Philip. So this is Cross Lake comparison. We compared effects of Asian carp invasion in 4 Great Lakes food webs with 4 Ecopath Ecosim models. And we also export our experience. So when other people want to model their ecosystem, they can do us or me, say, well, can you share your experience about how to model lakes? And so we just did this paper. And now in the discussion about projection future impacts, people would invited us too, because we have a lot of experience modeling invasive species. So all I want to say, we have gone a long way here, developed a method. So the lessons we learned is really the first thing you want to think is whether you have to deal with these and whether you can actually simplify your model so that the whole thing can be simpler. So our general approach at the beginning of these, say around 2010, we start with what data we have and build a method. Then we start to think about how to address these questions and adjustment. In the last, so now if you ask me, I would say, hey, what's the question you want to answer? Do we really need to build such a complicated model? And do we need to use all of our data? So this is a lesson learned here. I will give you an example and I will go through these quick. So here are two papers of mine published in 2016 and 2018. And they are one for Lake Huron, one for Lake Michigan. They are similar in many ways, but I did the second one much quicker. So here is why. So, well, Lakes Michigan and Lake Huron are very similar, and the data were from mostly the same sources. They are experiencing the same invasive species that created a new energy pathway. And so the question to address, one is top-down and bottom-up effects on the collapse of alewives, you just see at the beginning of the presentation in Lake Huron, and the stocking effects in Lake Michigan. So in Lake Huron model, we start with collecting data, build a method, and a question. So we want to use all available data because we don't know. We just want to use all of our data to be safe. And we build an Ecopath model as detailed as possible. And because of that, we had to use probably too many forcing functions to represent multiple invasions and then calibration. So all we want to do is to represent this food web model in the Ecopath period. And note that here is a microbial group. And then in the Ecosim period, we have these new pathways. So liberal muscle and quagga muscle invasion, round goby predator. So let's look at this again. So we have built this as complete to use as all of our data. And then we, on top of that, we now adding these invasions in our calibration. So, and now we have data and a method. It is really at that point we started to think what scenarios we want to have. So we, just like many other studies, we built a virtual full factorial experiment. We have top-down effects of Chinook salmon, different biomass levels, bottom-up effects from quagga muscle and nutrient, different levels. So a combination of 315 scenarios. So I am not showing the result, just showing that it is very complicated. And here I'm going to talk about the 2018 paper. And we started with what questions we want to answer. So we started with building scenarios. And building the scenarios, we actually reach out to managers and researchers and ask what they want to know. So you don't need to know these. The bigger picture is managers from different branches wanted to know different things. So we don't really have a consensus what they really wanted to know. So at the end, we have a lot of scenarios. So we have different scenarios for stocking, different salmon species, different scenarios for quagga muscle consumption, and different scenarios for nutrient load. So the big thing really is not how many scenarios we had. It really is because of doing that, we can simplify the model. So if the focus is really on how much biomass of salmon you are going to have, we probably don't need those microbial groups. And if the focus is really what will happen in the future, we probably also don't need those data or model the dynamics early, say, in last century. So all we need to do is we can include these invasive species in the model, and as long as we have enough time series data to calibrate. So at the end, we have an Ecopath model for 2002, and which already included liberal mussel and quagga mussel. So it is a much simpler food web model and much easier for us to calibrate and run scenario simulations. So this was pretty good. I won a best paper award when I still had long hair. And yeah, and this is really the key I want to highlight. So Lake Huron study was a really long paper with 29 pages. And this lag between last year in Ecosim and published online is really long. So when we finally published this paper online, it could be already out of date because the last year, the newest data in our study was from 2006. And for the Lake Michigan study, it was shorter. And because we could do it faster, we were able to publish it online. So like 3 years after the newest data in Ecosim calibration. So finally, some big take-home message we learned. So the model should be built to answer questions. This is very important. The software is flexible enough to model invasive species. And if you want some experience or some specific question, you can ask me. And it is also probably a better tool in many ways when it comes to study potential invasive species, when you don't have any data to build a population or single species model. So the big lesson we learned in last 10 years, needless to mention, people are skeptical about this modeling approach. And I think one thing I really want to say today is about the continuation. One thing we failed to do is really to build our next generation of modelers. So in 2010, we had 4 Ecopath, Ecosim modelers. At that time, we were all students or postdocs, but we already lost 2 They left, and they are probably not using Ecopath with Ecosim anymore. So they left the Great Lakes area, but still doing the work, but not using the model anymore. And we lost 2 without adding any new one in the last 10 plus years. So in the future, if you want to stay in the field and keep using Ecopath with Ecosim model, I think, I want you to think about that. Maybe build our next generation of modelers like Philly is doing here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yu-Chun. This was an excellent overview of all the work that's been done on modeling in invasions in the Great Lakes. I hesitate because that's all the works, and of course this is a overview of it. And
Thank you.
This is excellent. I think we would start off by taking questions for you, and then we have 2 brief introductions for a couple of papers, and if time permitting, I will finish off by giving an overview of some other modeling approaches with use from different areas, basically, with focus on what else have been done on invasion. So yeah, great, and let's open it for questions.
Hi, Yu-Chun. I had a question. Could you talk a little bit more about how you modeled the water clarity and changes in suspended solids with the mussels as mediation into your model?
Right. I wonder whether we have ever needed to deal with that, because so yeah, if you want to use mediation, we did use mediation, and then mediation would, if in that case mediation would be linked to the driver of that mediation would be the biomass of zebra and quagga mussel. But the second part would be the more challenging, because you really don't know how much that would affect different species differently. So if I am doing that now, I would use zebra and quagga mussel as a driver of mediation and apply that mediation function to say why that's knowingly to be a visual predator. But I think that is partly already accounted for in the calibration process, because when you have data to calibrate, this water is already very clear. So you can say those are already accounted for in the vulnerability parameter. So hope it is not too specific.
I see. I was wondering if you accounted for maybe, I'm not familiar with the system, but the water becoming clearer and then the effects that might have on primary production from your subaquatic vegetation. So in Florida, where I work, that would be a huge issue, or it would be a huge change. But
Right. So if you are talking about that, we do have mediation functions that drive the primary production difference. So what we did in the Saginaw Bay model was to have two primary producer groups, one for cyanobacteria, one for that benthic microphyte. So one cyanobacteria is growing to a very big biomass that would shed the light for the benthic algal and microphyte. I always say that wrong. So that you can use a mediation function like that to represent that. Our experience was that it did not work very well. It has very little effects. I don't know whether it works well or not. It was because we did not. The bloom is very episodic, so it did not last very long. And the time step in Ecopath with Ecosim is 1 month. And we rarely had algal bloom last a month. So at the end, that did not work. Did not work. It worked. It is just not very important. So if your system is slightly different, say the algal bloom lasted really long, or the clarity changed very fast, maybe 2 seasons. So yeah, you can use that kind of, so just parameterize 2 primary producer groups and use mediation to have them interact.
And Holden, I think it is an important aspect, and certainly mediation can do that. And what we are seeing in many systems is really much clearer water once you have these invasions, and that does lead to more growth of the ground, whatever we call it, the plants on the bottom. But I think there's a paper from Simcoe, or there is a paper from Simcoe by Goto 2020, where they used mediation. I think to this effect here to look at water clarity.
Thank you for the presentation. I was just wondering, I think you mentioned that you wouldn't recommend using method 3 when you start with like high initial biomass. Could you explain again why that's the case?
Well, in short, it affected your initial estimations from Ecopath. So that's the bigger problem in my experience. So Ecopath already has a lot of parameters, and you really don't want to make more parameters and more assumptions on that. So that's is basically you are adding more predator and prey into the food web, and then if you you will see the difference. So sometimes, for example, if you have a species feed on the invasive species in the ecopath, it will affect your Ecosim simulation. So I really do not recommend using high initial biomass in ecopaths for invasive species.
Hi, this is Yu-Chun. Hi. Hey, Yu-Chun, many thanks for
Hi.
your talk. It's very interesting.
Oh, thank you. Good to see you again.
Yeah, likewise. It's been a while. Nice. No, I wanted to draw attention to a paper that was published last year. I put a link in the chat by Satyacheswan. Difficult to pronounce, but she's a great girl. She wrote a plugin, the Eco Engineers, which allows you in Ecospace to calculate the engineering effect of mussels onto the ecosystem. That's also something that might be interesting to include in these kind of invasion models, to see the niche space they create for tiny critters.
Santiago?
Yeah. Hi, Yu-Chun. Thank you for your presentation. I have a question. Have you ever tried to move from Ecosim to Ecospace with an invasion? Because I've noticed that one thing that was very successful is that you use forcing functions and fishing. So when you're doing that spatially, that might pose a great challenge. So could you maybe talk a bit more about that?
Well, honestly, let's just say no. And that was really because we have not been good enough to secure funding to do that. That definitely has been under discussion. And so I really don't have an answer for that one. But if you want to talk more, we can talk more after this. So for the time, just for other question, I think.
Who's next?
I have a question. Hi, Yu-Chun. That was a great presentation. Thanks so much. I'm particularly interested in invasive species here in British Columbia. And right now, there is one invasive species in particular called the European green crab, which is making its way towards, across parts of British Columbia, particularly in a really productive area in near Vancouver. I'm wondering, so you talked a little bit about artificial fisheries, kind of as a method, I think, of extermination for some of these invasive species. How would you incorporate different levels of effort? Yeah, I guess my question is, how would you incorporate different levels of effort for exterminating, let's say, an invasive species? How would you make sure to ground truth, like what level of effort is actually possible? And how would you kind of show that in the model in terms of ways to prevent negative impacts of an invasive species? Hopefully I didn't throw too much at you at once.
Let me try to understand your question. So first, you are asking what is the level you need to keep those invasive species in check in the calibration and or before they invaded. And now the problem, if the question is if you want to have some control measure into the scenario, then how do you do that? Was that Well, so if the question has been like that, I would answer. So the first one is really easy. So you just need to maybe do some trial and error. That's one of the advantage in Ecosim. You can do it really quick. But one thing to remember is just make it enough. If you use a super high fusion rate in the calibration, that may come in some unwanted consequences. So that's the first. I don't think that's really a problem. And if you feel uncomfortable with using with these fishing out invasive species approach, you can use my approach. Basically, that means you force biomass and consumption to 0 before their invasion. I personally prefer to use that approach. So you can just force biomass consumption to close 0 before their invasion, and then release them to allow the invasion occur. And then about harvest rate, it is a little bit challenging because you basically have 2 assumptions now, 2 uncertainty sources. One is how much, you are using a hypothetical fishery to remove a simulated biomass. So I think how to ground truth, that's really challenging. I don't have a very good answer to that. The thing you can do is to simulate more scenarios so that you can have a bulk or an envelope or possible future. That is also very helpful too. Yeah, for grounded truth, that's challenging. It is really challenging. To date, we still don't know how much quagga mussel we have in the Great Lakes, for example. It has been 20 years.
Thank you. I guess you could just assume best case and worst case scenario and work within those parameters,
right,
perhaps?
That's I am saying. And you can also see what would be more likely. So maybe a lot of different scenarios would give you the similar result. So that you can say things like more harvest may not give you better control if you are not doing this and that, for example.
And Spencer, the paper that Holden will be discussing in a few minutes relates to this, and there are several other studies also that looks at this question about can you fish out an invader? And I'm going to give an overview of some of those studies. Marta, you're getting ready, I can see.
Well, I don't have a specific question. I really enjoyed the presentation, and I know it's kind of a challenge to have these invasive species behaving in EWE. So I truly appreciate the work that has been done by Yu-Chun. Thank you.
Thank you.
Marta, my last slide is just a reference to spatial invasion and how it's modeled in Eco-Ocean. Do you want to say anything about that?
Basically, in Eco-Ocean, the notion of invasion is a bit different because we are modeling the global ocean. So there's no real invaders in the sense that the species are moving around, but they occur in one place of another of a system. So in this sense, it's easier for us because they are already in the model from the beginning. It's a question of having the species moving and invading areas, but they are already there. So from this side, it's easier for us. I think the challenge here is to make the correct species move. So as we were saying the other day, right, in each cell, we have a potential pool of species, but then according to where we are in latitude, longitude, that potential pool of species is restricted to with native ranges and with the response functions to the real species that are there. That's but yeah, the movement is it's another story. But there's no real there's no species that will appear in eco-ocean because they are all there. It's a global ocean.
Yeah, and I guess that's the case. That's always the case that species come from somewhere. That they don't come from space. It actually is kind of funny to think about this, that in many places we're talking about invasions and we're talking about invasive species, but there's also a parallel naming for this about using the term aliens. It's done in the Mediterranean for in a number of cases, and I haven't actually drawn the conclusion based on what you're saying, Marta, that aliens are actually someone that come from outer space, aren't they? So that's the kind of things we don't have in the global model. But yeah, aliens, interesting. All right, I think we are running out of questions. Unless Holden, was that because you were ready to go next, or did you have a question that you showed up on camera?
Doing a little tech adjustments, but I also did want to comment on that we're looking at some similar questions here in terms of tropicalization in the Gulf of Mexico of species on the move, where the northward expansion of some species are moving into the system, and so in effect, they're acting like invaders. So we have a large piscivore predator here called snook, which is also a popular game fish that's moved into the system and in some ways behaving like an invasive species. So Dylan Nickerson has modeled that in his Ecopath model. So it's just a comment on that this idea of what constitutes an invasive species can be kind of nebulous, worthy of fully thinking through.
Thinking about it, I wonder if invasive has to, you have to think about an invasion being like when, like D-Day, you have thousands of people coming on shore, or you have millions or billions of zebra mussel. I wonder if that's where the different terminology comes from. How, if the population explodes and take over, usually is that
right?
That
no, that's what how we see invasive species. And invasive, this word means they came in and exotic species came in and became really successful. So, and it is also a negative word. Usually we talk about species we like more, and although they are like invasive species, but we call that naturalized. So, for example, Chinook salmon is not an invasive species. We don't usually say they are still introduced and they are still one time really big population, but we call them naturalized. So invasive really is a word for species from outside of the system and became really successful, and their effects are really negative. So.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I'll look for a paper. There's a paper that discusses the linguistics of invasive species, which I thought was really interesting. And I know it starts from Charles Elton's work in the 50s. And so a lot of the terminology came from post-World War II ideas. And so there's a lot of like warfare terms, like invasion, that's used in that. And it can cause issues, for instance, with the terms of like aliens and exotic.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of interest in assessing on forehand whether a species could be a potential invader and what potential success rate it could be as an invader. What are your thoughts about that, Yu-Chun? So if you have a species that might invade, yeah.
Well, that is really the reason we have these. We have done some work, so that's really potential invasive species. However, using Ecopath with Ecosim to evaluate which species can be successful, you need really to narrow down species you want to evaluate to begin with. So in this case, we had only 2 species, which are bighead and silver carp. They are very risky. They are so close to the Great Lakes now, and they are very invasive. We knew that. And we have another paper to do another 3 invertebrate invaders. So you really need to narrow down the range. But at a global scale, if you want to have a list of potential invaders, people usually started with habitat and niche overlaps that can help you narrow down to 30 or 50 species. But I'm just saying, I don't know. But if you want to use Ecopath with Ecosim model to evaluate invasion potential for 30 or 50 species, that's just not very feasible, in my opinion. So yeah, for a few very important species, I think it's doable, and we have done that.
All right, thank you. I think we should continue with introduction to a couple of papers. The first one there, Holden, I have you. I volunteered you to do this for a very specific reason.
Are you seeing the presentation screen? I'm not seeing the green Zoom bar.
It looks good, yeah.
Okay. So just giving a brief introduction to a paper we worked on a couple of years ago. This one also led by Dave Shigaris, who talked earlier in the course on multiple ecosystem stressors. So in that model, in some ways was furthering develop the impacts of both lionfish and the deepwater horizon spill. But moving back, what this work started from was Dave's dissertation research, where he developed this.
Hold on.
Yeah.
We actually, maybe you can swap screens, because we're actually seeing your presenter view. Is that?
I think it's under display settings at the top on the left.
Display settings?
There's this.
There we go. Much better.
Okay. So I think this is a really great example of what can be done too of when you develop a very good ecosystem model like Dave did. So the original work was building this model for the West Florida shelf. So this is the west side, the state of Florida in the Gulf of Mexico here. And he did this to look at different management applications and ask different management questions. And after this model was built, we had lionfish move into the system and become an explosive invasion. And from this, the work was mostly done in this 15-day workshop performed in 2015. And this is what actually got me to UF and in the grad school, where students were brought in as well as university and agency partners to help develop these questions. And so we took this model of the West Florida shelf. So there's 50 some odd species. This is a cool graphic that Rob Aarons developed. So it looks like this is that flow diagram that you see in Ecosim, but spun around in 3 dimensions. And we wanted to see, well, what happens when you bring lionfish in. So specifically, in the Ecopath and Ecosim model, we brought in lionfish in 2 age stanzas. We separated out juveniles and adults at about their length of maturity, about 155 millimeters. And this was done both based on the ontogenetic shifts in their diets to be older and more piscivorous, and then also based on vulnerability to human harvest. And the model allowed us to ask some, I think, really germane research questions. So we were able to look at, did historical fishing pressure in the Gulf of Mexico make the region more vulnerable to a marine invasion? We wanted to look at how specifically lionfish were impacting native fish, so not just through predation, but through trophic effects and competition. and then look at different management strategies, both in terms of lionfish harvest and reef fish, and how we can manage those impacts. And so I can't really go too far into the results, but what's really interesting is we can look at the different trajectories of the lionfish invasion. So this isn't change in the lionfish invasion, which is of course that explosion of eruption, but we could toggle these knobs in these kind of worst case and best case scenarios of changing some of the vulnerability parameters. So this is representative by high predator effectiveness. And then also looking at management scenarios of lionfish harvest and reef fish harvest, and also whether or not lionfish exhibited cannibalism, which now we have pretty good evidence that they do. And I won't go too far into these, but I just wanted to show that we could look at some of the results based on these like multi-dimensional type plots of looking at both reef fish harvest management strategies and different lionfish harvest strategies, and then looking at changes in lionfish biomass, as well as some of the prey fish biomass, and then also the large predator biomass, which are generally all important fisheries species in the region. So just a couple of key takeaways. We found that some of the trophic interactions caused counterintuitive responses, which was really interesting. We're able to ID the groups that were most hurt by the lionfish invasion, mainly their prey species, but also saw that the large-bodied predators in the area, and these are very important species in terms of Florida's economy and management, were also significantly hurt from lionfish due to trophic interactions and competition. And then we were able to look at some of the management outcomes of toggling these knobs. So we saw that reduced reef fish harvest can help mitigate the lionfish impacts and also suppress future invasions. And that harvesting lionfish is indeed an effective control method based on our simulations in the model. And really the best approach to this is a holistic strategy of combining reduced reef fish harvest and then also lionfish control.
Thank you very much, Holden. That was a great overview. We will be returning to some of these things in connection with what I will introduce, and afterwards there will be questions there, so I suggest we hold the questions. Matt, you have a difficult task on reviewing a review quickly in one slide or something like that, yeah?
Yeah, that will be fun, for sure. So, yeah, this review paper was titled Advances and Challenges in Modeling the Impacts of Invasive Alien Species on Aquatic Ecosystems. So the goal of this paper was to review different modeling approaches that have been used to evaluate the impacts of invasive species. I thought the paper did an excellent job at evaluating the use of different types of models, species and population level models, and also multiple species and ecosystem level models, and kind of explaining the utilization of different models and how they can be used to answer different types of questions. And they listed a bunch of different models that they used in a table that they had, and did a great job, I think, at that explaining of the different uses of these different level models. Some of the main findings from this literature review were that most studies on invasive alien species were focused in North America and Europe on primarily low-level trophic species such as fish and mollusks, mainly bivalves like the dreissenid mussels that we talked about earlier, and assess the detrimental impacts of invasive species. However, the use of multi-species and ecosystem level models can also provide an opportunity to look at both negative and positive impacts of invasive species on the native species. In terms of ecosystem-based management, the authors recommend the use of spatial temporal ecosystem models that combine both trophic interactions, human activities, and abiotic factors. This is hard enough to do without looking at invasive species, but when you combine invasive species, it's very important to have knowledge on the ecosystem before the invasion, after the invasion, and also during the invasion as well, in terms of understanding how the ecosystem is being affected by the introduction of that invasive species, the establishment and spread of that invasive species, both spatially and temporally. So in order to kind of better understand how invasive species are affecting the ecosystems and better understand the ecosystem before and after the invasion, the authors recommend that further studies can integrate environmental DNA, meta-barcoding, and machine learning in order to better understand how the early detection of invasive species and also the potential trophic interactions in the future, and couple this with the spatial temporal modeling in order to help advance invasive species modeling.
Thank you very much, Matt. That was an excellent overview.
Thank you.
And with this, I think the next thing we're going to do is that I'm going to share my screen. What I intend to do is to give a very quick review put together for this class of modeling invasive species, how it has been done in EWE. And it's going to be a little bit like a shopping list in the sense that I will talk about a lot of different studies, focusing as much as I can on the methodology that was used in these studies, but not exclusively that, because my intention with this is really to point out to you that there has been a number of studies, if you are interested in invasive species, alien species, there are resources to look at. So it really is to provide pointers. That's what I want to do with this. And also to point out that, yes, this is actually something that can be addressed using ecosystem modeling. And I'll start out here by, I put this little notice in. This is from yesterday's paper here, I think from the Vancouver Sun here in Vancouver, BC. And it was a story about how this weekend the conservation officers visited, I think, made 600 visits to aquarium shops across the province to look for zebra mussels. And in today's newspaper, there was actually that something similar to this happened in Alberta. So the fear was that these moss balls that are being put into people's aquaria, that they, they get in there, they may grow too much, and people might dump them into a watershed, and that spells disaster. This is a big question. Both the kind of invasive species, such as the zebra mussels, and also, of course, the species that extend their range into areas, both are of concern and something we are looking at. So, how do you model it? Well, one issue here is there is kind of a catch-22 of modeling invasive species. And if you don't know what catch-22 is, you should really read the book about Joseph Heller there, or watch the movie about it. It's about how a pilot, in order to not fly these dangerous missions during the World War, if he goes and asks to be relieved of them because he says he's crazy, then the doctor would say, well, if you were crazy, you would not come and ask to be relieved, and no sane person would actually fly this dangerous mission. Therefore, if you come and say it, you are not insane, you are smart to come and say it because it's too dangerous. You get caught in this catch-22. That's kind of how it is for modeling invasive species. Coll would call them vampires in the basement. In order to predict how an invasive and its prey and predators are going to react, we need to know something about what the invasive will do, and that relates to carrying capacity and how it impacts its predators and prey. And to get a measure of how it's going to do that, we need to know how it will react to the invasion. So we get into this. In order to predict the invasion, and the effects of the invasion, we need to know what is going to happen when we have an invasion. So that's a catch-22. We can't know it. We need to know something about density dependence. All models need to have that in them to be realistic models that actually works. How do we know the carrying capacity when they're not there? We don't know. So we get into this again. So what do we do? Does it mean that we can't model invasions? Well, we can, but there are these limitations. We can do what-if scenarios. So we can ask, can we make the biomass of this invasive species increase up to this level here? Is that possible? Can we get the model to do that? That's the first step about actually modeling it, if we are modeling the invasion. And if we can do that, we can look at what's the consequences for prey and predators. Example of this would be here in BC, they've been developing this monster salmon that grows 4 times as quick as other salmon. Now, we were asked by DFO some years ago, the ones who were working on this, what would the impact be if this monster salmon, quick, whatever it's called, super salmon or something, what would happen if it gets out into the environment? Nobody could answer that question because we don't know if it would be able to reproduce to compete with the existing species. But we could at least say, if it came out in the environment, if it established itself to this level, what would the consequences be for the food web-related consequences? So that's the kind of questions we can ask with this. So we can ask these kinds of what-ifs. We can look at these kind of what-if scenarios. That's what it really boils down to. That is possible. So how we make it increase, there are different approaches for this, and in Yu-Chun's talk, you got an excellent overview of that, and indeed what happens in the Great Lakes doesn't stay in the Great Lakes. What happens there is a good source of inspiration for you if you're working with these and you want to do it. I have reminded that the papers we heard about here, they are in the collection. Good. So for Great Lakes, one of the early papers, and I'm not going to talk about the Great Lakes, but there is some interesting. One of the very first studies on this was the one by Sean Cox and Jim Kitchell that Yu-Chun talked about, where it was a very early attempt, and yeah, they could reproduce the invasion after the fact. They could make nice fit to time series. Something similar in Columbia River Reservoir in this 2005 paper. It was again modeling the post-invasion state and asked questions such as, would reduction of these non-indigenous species compete with the juvenile salmon? One of the major concerns in this. And their conclusion was, no, if you really want to rebuild the juvenile salmon, it was not a competition, it was a question of reducing predation that was necessary on the salmon. Okay, moving on to catfish in North Carolina River. Another study here by Bill Pine and some of his colleagues. Again, they modeled the post-invasion state. Early study, it was not quite clear when I was reading this what kind of vulnerabilities they had, but they evaluate the impact of invasive catfish. And oh, there's a typo. Lionfish suppressed native fish with 5 to 50%. I guess it would be catfish that we are talking about here. But what they did find was something you see in several of the coming studies, that in order to when you have a successful invader or alien species coming into a system, you can't, when it has been successful, it also means that it is successful. So if you want to control it, you're talking long term. It's not going to go away just like that. Long-term exploitation generally is required in these cases. So one of the first studies there that actually modeled an anticipated invasion was the paper by Ernesto Ayers Gonzalez which anticipated invasion of lionfish into the Caribbean, Yucatan. So that's down on the north coast of the Yucatan Peninsula, down in the Gulf of Mexico. I was involved in that, in helping setting it up. And what we did was we modeled lionfish as having 4 stanzas, so 4 age groups. And then you can see the up here. You can see how that stands with the population model. And then in the Ecopath model, we started pre-invasion, and we had just a tiny bit of adult lionfish in that model. When we then started the model, okay, also related to, I think it was you asked about, Emma, was why such a tiny bit? And as we discussed with Yu-Chun, it's, if you make that biomass big, it's going to have a lot of impact on the utilization of the whole model, which has consequences when you go into a time dynamic model. That Ecopath start baseline is used for all of the subsequent analysis for parameters in there in the time dynamic model, and making it a tiny biomass means that it's going to have very little impact, but we can still get it in there with a reasonable diet, which is important for when we later reintroduce them and let them explode. So here the lionfish was fished out at the start of the Ecosim simulation, and then they were reintroduced to a small biomass after 5 years. And as you can see down in the lower right graph here, they were able to explode quite quickly. We saw a 900 times increase from that initial biomass, which actually brought them up to the level they had established themselves further north, up in, I think, in the Bahamas, where they were after the introduction in, which probably happened in Florida. This was one of the areas where they very early spread to. And you can also see, by the way, in the middle plot there on the right, the time series file that we used for it, how it had high fishing on all the stanzas as a starting point. And then in 1995 here, we reintroduced the lionfish. You can't even, if you look at the plot down below, you can see they die out so fast we don't even see them on this plot here. So that was an example of this. And actually, I talked about a lot of this, but what we did for this was to look at 4 control scenarios. And the conclusion from this was the impact of lionfish would have consequences for many of its prey. That's on the lower left graph. But other groups may actually benefit from this invasion. There's different food web effects that happen through this, and it was also quite clear from this that a long-term control was necessary, among others because the adults go very deep and would may be out of range for diver control. So it's complicated to do this. Yu-Chun has talked about the Great Lakes, so I will not get into that here and now. Mentioning something only that as conclusion from this early study by Brian Langsett, it's also something that Yu-Chun talked about. The choice between forcing and fitting depends on the objectives for which the model was developed. Again, an example of when you're doing modeling, make your question very clear from the start, or you'll be fumbling around searching for what do I do with this model with all these things it can do. Focusing on that question And remembering that when you build the model, when you use the model, is really, really critical. Many more studies. Here's an example from the Adriatic Sea, which is more about non-indigenous species, so alien species moving up in the Adriatic Sea here east of the Boot, or east of Italy. And as this water warms, of course, you'll get northward expansion of ranges, and eventually get up to a north where you can't go any further. It'll be stuck up there at dead end. Simon Libraletto and colleagues there up in Trieste model potential impact of this, and it was a model that was I don't think they looked at the static situation with this movement, so there's no clear lesson in here. They didn't fit the model to time series data, so there's no really clear lessons for how to do it from it, but it's an interesting paper. So zebra mussels in Mill Lake in Minnesota. Kumar and Tony Pitcher worked on that here, and in this case they have a model that represents 1985, and the actual invasion happened in 2005, so it's also a pre-invasion model. The zebra mussel, also called Desnys, along with quagga mussels, had a high biomass in the model initially, so contrary to what Yu-Chun suggested and what I would suggest, and then they were then fished out, and the model was fitted to data, and they were able to replicate what happened pretty well, including an interesting thing was that they only used part of the time series for the fitting, and then they compared the predictions for the last 5 years to what actually happened. So there are really neat aspects to this study, including that the model seemed to see the field data set. Let's try here. The black is the model predictions on this top right graph. The gray is measurements from the field, but transparency in it, which will improve as these mussels filter more and more water, actually fits really well with the build-up of mussels here. So that's kind of neat. Moving on. Lionfish, West Florida. Holden covered this, so we don't need to do much about it here. Just point out ecosystem vulnerability parameters are really important. That's one of the conclusions here. They had a neat way of modeling that in the study, and thinking about how do we model that, what kind of constraints can we put on the capabilities or the potential impact of the invader. That was an interesting part of this. And Jeroen pointed to the ecosystem engineers in work by, I'm going to be challenged here by mentioning her name, full name, there's such, I won't, but they've done some nice work in South Africa on looking at ecosystem engineers in the form of mussels, invading mussels and barnacle, using mediation to get some of these impacts in, and it has resulted in development of a plugin for EWE, the one that Jerome provided a reference to here. So I'll leave it at that. And move on to Lake Simcoe in Ontario. Goto and colleagues there asked 2 questions. How does fish biomass rebuilding respond to predator manipulations following invasions? And how do these invasive modify the fish biomass rebuilding in a situation like this, where at the same time as this was going on were reductions in lake nutrient levels? So as they were cleaning up the water entering into the lake, runoff from agriculture not the least, primary production will decrease in these lakes. So you have a confounding of invading impact of invaders, impact of stocking, and impact of lower nutrients leading to less primary production. They have a lot of data, 30-year history with 37 time series, and used mediation and environmental drivers. They even looked at the uncertainty associated with the environmental drivers, and then addressed various what-if questions with fishing, stocking, and nutrient reduction, and invasives, how it would impact the rebuilding of target species. It wasn't quite clear for me how they modeled the increase of invasives when I was reading this paper here a few days ago. I told you it's going to be a long shopping list of papers. We're not there yet, but we're getting closer. Aliens in the northeastern Mediterranean Sea. So these are species. Been several studies here in both in Israel and in Turkey, where this one is from, looking at the consequences of these alien species entering through the channel and coming up and impacting it. And in this paper here from Turkey, they looked at it based on network analysis. So it's based on the static Ecopath model. And one of the interesting things you can get out of such a model, even without going for time dynamics, is to look at competitive impacts in the system. And we can do that with a mixed trophic impact analysis that we talked about earlier. It won't answering what-if questions, what will happen if you change things, but you can look at the competition in this case here, how the different groups impact each other. In this case here, what they summed up was on the left here in the red, you see the impact, the cumulative impact. So it's derived from here, summing up all these impacts, where you have in rows you have the impacting species, and in columns they have the impacted species. So you can sum this up down the rows and see how big impact the various groups have. In this case here, the alien species, the invaders, have had a very big impact on the ecosystem. That's clear from just looking at the food web. In Norway, northern Norway, there has been an invasion of king crab. They were actually introduced by Norwegians, and Helena, who's somewhere on this call now, is looking at snow crab invasions, or it's an invasion. They are expanding their range, I should say, up northern Norway, the Barents Sea, and again about the importance there. Predictions are that snow crab may be the most important fishery is it in Norway or northern Norway? I'm not quite sure, but a really, really important fishery. If it can beat out the low-floating cod with importance, you can see something about how important it is. This study here, they added king crab with a low biomass, and then they forced the biomass, and there was no time series fitting, but this study again could be used to evaluate what are the potential impacts on other parts of the ecosystem, and that's what they did here. Need a break now, right? I'm giving you this long shopping list. So the break is you get a picture or two. One of the pleasures we have here in BC and at UBC is that during the important years, and the important years is not when the Olympic is on, it's when the Winter Olympics is on. 2014, 18, 22, we arranged a field trip up to Shuswap Lake to watch sockeye salmon, because sockeye salmon is kind of an Olympic species. Used to be the foundation for salmon fisheries, most important fishery in BC. And the crazy thing about this, it's only in the years with the Winter Olympics. Now, you could make a correlation on that, and you can, well, it doesn't work right now. I think they're postponing the Winter Olympics, but generally it works. So how you explain that is going to be a challenge. But the sockeye salmon come back in every 4 years, and they move they move up to Shoeshop Lake, actually pretty much along the way that we're driving in the car up there, which is a 6-7 hour drive. And when you get up there, you'll find the sockeye. Here you have them making the nests red on the picture there on the right. It's very impressive. What would happen if we have an invasion of zebra mussels? Not right here, but in the lake down there below. So this they spawn in tributaries, and then the young ones move down in lakes below. These are, I could talk much more about that. I don't want to go there. I shouldn't go there. So a PhD student with me, Patricia Woodruff, has been modeling what might happen if we have a potential dragonid invasion in Shoeshop Lake. And an interesting thing there is that these dragonids, so that's the zebra mussel and quagga mussel that Yu-Chun was talking about for the Great Lakes, they haven't made it here yet. That's also what I talked about, the little zebras up in my first picture. Their depth range is limited. They need to be where there's things to filter. So what you see on this plot here is on the top, the depth distribution in Shoeshop Lake, and for the 2 mussel species, then where they may occur. And they are limited in their range. Now, an interesting thing about this model here, where she ran from 1975 and at 100 years ahead, is that, and the way she set it up was with actually with a fairly high invasive biomass from the beginning, then kept down by high F, and then released it, and we had the invasives coming back and taking over. It calls for having high vulnerabilities for the invasive. They need to be able to increase. And in her model, she used mediation, because the sockeye, when they die, they're being flushed down into to the lakes, or the nutrients from them are being flushed down into the lakes below, and that actually establishes production that benefits the young. They stay for about a year or two in that lake before they move out. And there's several competitors in that lake, and she looked at that, how that worked. And it was interesting. The model was able to replicate this 4-year sockeye cycle when it wasn't fitted to data. We couldn't do it when it was fitted. So we ended up not fitting them all to data, but changing some of the vulnerabilities to reflect that some groups were far from carrying capacity. And out of this came then predictions for what different levels of mussels, the impact of different levels of mussels on various groups in the ecosystem. And this paper actually came out this week, and it's part of a special issue that's freely available. So you have the reference to that whole issue here. So we talked about modeling invasion spatially, and when we get to the Eco-Ocean model in some weeks' time, Marta will be talking more about how we model range expansions rather than invasions connected to cool climate change. This is a topic that is of much interest, as you will know. Almost there. In summary, yes, there is a catch-22 when we're talking about invasive species, those that come in and take over the ecosystem. What is the effect going to be of those? That is really difficult to predict, but there are a number of things that we can do to make educated guesses about the impact that they may have on invasive and other species. It's also quite clear that there isn't just one way of modeling these invasions. Yu-Chun pointed that out and gave an overview of a number of different approaches, and that's really worth digging deeper into reading those papers if you're modeling alien or invasive species. What often works well is to try. That really helps a lot. Low initial biomasses, fish out the invader. Either just see what happens when you just stop fishing, artificial fishing after a while. Will it make it go back? Do you need to force the biomass to get it to reintroduce it? Biomass accumulation in Ecopath has an indication too, and it may help to try to play with that. Or you may end up having to force the biomasses. The bottom line is it is possible to do this.
Can I make a comment? So actually, 2 comments. This method can be also used to model species restoration or reintroduction, because the way you are modeling invasives, the treatment to the invasive species or groups would be very similar. So my research focus now is actually native species restoration. We are trying to stock some locally extincted native species, and I am thinking to use the same method to model whether it can work.
Excellent, that's a good point, yeah. Okay. Marta, did I miss something? Did I miss a paper?
Well, I just was adding in the chat some more papers that I from the top of my head. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. My internet is slow, but just more examples of papers fitting time series and playing with the options.
Good, thank you. So, any questions?
Spencer put a nice question in the chat, Philly. Is there an example of Ecopath being used for species restoration?
Yu-Chun, you have worked with that?
We are just sending a proposal, so sorry.
Oh.
Yeah, we just wrote a proposal on that. If it is funded, next year maybe. Not now.
Hi. So I was just saying that I use a similar approach, but just with the Ecopath component as part of my PhD thesis to emulate river herring restoration in northeastern US marine ecosystem.
All right, thank you. And also the paper I referred to about from Lake Simcoe in Ontario by Goto and colleagues, they are also dealing with restoration or rebuilding of target species stocks. There is a lot of things happening on this in this area, really. It's neat. And Marta just put a 2021 paper. Just when you look at it, the number of papers from 2020 and 2021 already that deals with this topic is quite impressive. Marta wants to write instead of talk.
Sorry, my camera doesn't want to turn on anymore.
Call a technician.
Yeah.
Someone who knows about IT and that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Who could that be?
Somewhere in Barcelona, I'm sure you can find someone.
Yeah, maybe. But I'm just saying here in the chat that we are trying to do a similar thing to what we did for these in the Wadden Sea for seagrass. We are trying to do the same for corals and the Posidonia seagrass here in the Mediterranean Sea. So we're working on it as well.
All right. Well, I would think we have reached the point where, first of all, I should say thank you to Yu-Chun for coming here and for giving an excellent overview of the expansive work that's been done on invasive species in connection with the Great Lakes. It's neat to see, and given the importance of it and the problems that it has caused, it's interesting to see this kind of great scale experiment almost happening there from an ecological point of view, and how you're addressing it. So thank you very much for that. It's been a pleasure. Nice work.
Thank you very much.